So topic of today, green social prescribing, but also some thoughts about what might be conceived of as a good life. You know, what are we trying to achieve at the end of all of this? It's not just a thing called social prescribing, it's something more than that. So I'm going to just run through 4 sections in the 20 minutes here, set the scene for the climate crisis. You know about this, you'll understand where we are with COP26 coming up at the end of this month, and the urgency of where we are. Just a reminder, in 1990, there were 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That was a safe operating space for humanity. In just one generation, 30 years, it's now gone to 417. And we talk about the need to make these changes to net zero by 2050. That's only one more generation from where we are at the moment. And if it carries on growing at this rate, all bets are off. So it is a serious issue. We have heard this year about record temperatures in the northwest of the US, the hottest day ever in the world in Death Valley, record temperatures in Siberia. Every year brings these new kind of growing concerns that I think kind of alarm us all in lots of different ways. Just a reminder of where that also sits at the moment. We've seen the disappearance of the first glacier in Iceland just recently, the Jökull, the loss of the first of their 270 glaciers. In the Himalaya, there are 46,000 glaciers. This is Rakaposhi on the left side of the picture here. And they supply drinking water to 1.6 billion people in Asia. And if we find ourselves at +2 degrees, which is kind of what would be considered one of the successes of COP26, if we could get people signing up to 2 degrees. At 2 degrees, 90% of the glaciers in the Himalaya disappear. It's that serious. And we have to find a new source of drinking water for 1.6 billion people. So we're at this tipping point in the 2020s where we need urgent action, but we're not quite sure what to do. I want to finish the talk having talked a little bit about nature and health and green social prescribing with what we can do and how we link the climate crisis to our ways of living and indeed to the kinds of things that you're doing at Communigrow. First though, just a reminder of the inequalities in carbon emissions. This is per capita carbon dioxide emissions by country, 222 countries across the world. 56 countries emit less than 1 ton per person. If we could all get to 1 ton, that would be a safe place for humanity. So 56 countries, 1.3 billion people need to consume more stuff, not less. But everybody else in the world needs to consume much less. Just a reminder that as GDP increases, so do carbon dioxide emissions. This is a log scale. So each major line is an increase of 10-fold. The countries with the highest emissions produce more than 50 tons of carbon per person, and 1 ton is the target. If you could just hold that thought, I'll come back to that later on about what we can then do and how that ties into our practices. So climate crisis, we need to be low carbon. Oh, right, what do we do about that? We've been researching for 20 years nature and health at the University of Essex, the impacts of activities in natural places. We called this green exercise to begin with. There's green care, there's ecotherapy, there's a whole range of terms now. And we know the following, the research says this: everyone seems to benefit. All environments are important. They do different things, but they were all beneficial. All age groups and social groups benefit. All types of health status benefit. If you're not well or ill, you'll benefit from being in nature. If you're well, you'll also benefit from being in nature. And all types of activities. In other words, to use a scientific phrase here, there are no counterfactuals. There's no context where we find that nature is bad for somebody. It might be hard work if you're a member of a conservation group chopping back the brambles, but that's probably bringing another kind of benefit. So what do we know? That therefore, once we know that evidence, we know that deliberate interventions and ecotherapies work. That if we design activities and environments for people, they deliver health benefits. And a whole range of new language comes along on the back of this. We, in our research group, we deliberately coined a phrase called a dose of nature. We called going outside a dose of nature. It's very deliberate medicalization of language. And we were able to measure what the benefits of different times of dose. And a paper that was published in 2010 had 1,200 stories written about it across the world. So there's a lot of interest in this. That's the good thing that I find. We also talk about health services from nature. We talk about now ecosystem services, the economic value that we get from nature activities. And we talk about nature-based interventions, shorthand NBIs. Coming back to this in a moment, because we've measured some of that real economic value and showed what a difference it makes. Implementation is harder. You need to think about the design of lived environments, inside and outside, and we need cultural approval for real access to green space. We once worked with a group of Asian women in Bradford. If you live in the middle of Bradford, the moors are above the town. You can just about imagine where they are. But they were first generation women from Gujarat, and they had never been on the moor. We took them up to the moor and they said, this is just fantastic. It's just like Gujarat, except it wasn't at all. Ecologically, it wasn't, but the wind, the air, the sense of freedom, the plants, the birds, the elements of nature were identical. And it was those things that people felt a direct connection and a kind of release from the stresses and anxieties of general life. But you need cultural approval to do that. So you can have an environment, but people may not feel they can go there. So we have to find ways to help that happen. Design matters. We know that internal design matters hugely. Hospitals are just not designed for letting in nature. And yet there has been research that has shown that east-facing rooms and rooms with green views need fewer, the patients need fewer pain drugs and leave hospital sooner, usually 1 to 2 days sooner than in rooms without a green view. We know that hospital gardens help healing. There's a project to try to introduce a garden into every hospital in the country, but they're only going to affect a small number of people. And the contrast I'd make here is that if you look at hospices, every hospice I've been in is like the picture at the bottom here. Light, plants, sense of freedom, peace. The Maggie's centres, the Maggie's cancer centres that emerged out of Scotland that have now gone multinational, similar kind of design. So when we can design for greenness, bring it indoors in this way, and light and elements of the world in this way, it makes an immediate difference to how we feel. So we now know that an immediate dose of nature, the first 5 minutes make a tremendous difference. If you go out into the garden, it's immediate benefit. If you have places that are natural as well as social context, as Amy, you were just saying about Communigrow, then you also have the context for social interaction. And we begin to find that nature is protective. So for example, people who engage regularly, walking twice a week, for example, will set back the onset of dementias on average by 10 years. So that kind of cognitive engagement with the environment as well as the physical activity has a direct benefit for longevity and healthy longevity. Lots of research, different aspects of this, but nature is good for you. So how does this play into the thoughts about green social prescribing? Well, the Chief Medical Officer in 2013 and 19, in her annual reports, noted that health costs arising from the ways of living were increasing. She called for a new canon of prevention. And it's interesting, this language was developed before COVID, and we're quite clear now because of the pandemic that we need to prevent health costs by maintaining health. But that wasn't the case beforehand. So they were trying to make the case that health was an asset that needed protecting, and we also needed to protect the NHS. And there are a large number of people who have what are called long-term health conditions, LTCs. 50% of GP appointments are made by people with LTCs. Of the 15 million people, nearly a quarter of the people in Britain have LTCs, and they constitute 70% of hospital inpatient days. So the challenge is to find those people and to engage them with the kinds of green social prescribing activities, the sorts of things that you're doing at Communigrow. These are called social models of health, and it's quite interesting that we're beginning to see this emergence of a whole range of new institutional relationships and partnerships that are structuring the people's behaviors, influencing current health and future longevity. And we know now that green space reduces mortality, reduces stress hormones, increases physical activity, changes dietary decisions and habits, affects longevity. Not all at once, but those where there's strong evidence for that. And on the back of those things, and you'll see my mapping in a moment onto what one would think of as a good life, brings also happiness and life satisfaction, which are kind of higher level aims for us all. So social prescribing, green social prescribing, is intended to bring a whole range of proven therapeutic contexts, make them available to people. There are lots of successful operations in this country. Many offer 50, some more than 200. Bromley by Bow in East London is probably the most wonderful, really, in terms of the range of things. But coverage is still patchy. So you have a very well-developed social prescribing network in certain places, and a rather thin one can be just down the road. And there seems to be referral for all sorts of things, for advice and knowledge, skills development, activities in social groups, activities with therapeutic aims. I think the green social prescribing bit is for the last two of those, for number 3 and 4. Social groups in natural environments, NBIs, nature-based interventions. And we published some research last year where we measured the economic consequences of acting and not acting. We looked at a number of nature-based interventions from some charitable third sector groups in this region of East Anglia. Woodland therapy, community gardening, the work of mind in what they called eco-minds projects, and also some outdoor Tai Chi. And we benchmarked this against the Office for National Statistics data on life satisfaction and happiness. So we wanted to know, if people engage in these things, what was then the impact upon their well-being? And there's a very big database that's now been developed. And we found that this is a scale from 1 to 10. I'm not showing you the graph. It's kind of a bit too much detail at this point. But the average of all of the projects was to increase the life satisfaction measures on the scale of 1 to 10 by +1. Now, that's a really big change. It's very difficult to do that to design that in other parts of life. It doesn't happen very much positively. +1 would be the effect that parents feel when they have a baby. It's an effect of marriage. -1 is a death or a divorce. They're really big changes in life. And we found that these nature-based interventions were producing +1 changes on average, sometimes higher. Sometimes people did fall and came back in again. And for most of these people, they were starting very low. This is people who are down at the scores of about 4, which is, for the UK average, is 7.7. So they have a long way to go to get to the mean for the UK. So they work. What we were able to do then is to use the Treasury model, the so-called Green Book. It's not environmentally green, but it's just called the Green Book, which is the economic measures for showing how you measure long-term benefits, adjusting for discount rate, inflation, and years of intervention. And we were able to show that the costs prevented, these are health costs and public service costs, were £800 by the end of year 1 for health and public service, for reduced loneliness, an extra £700, and for the benefits created through increased life satisfaction and happiness, about tenfold on top of that, more than £9,000. And then we're able to do the analysis over the 10-year period, talking about net present value over 10 years. And they are very substantial benefits. If you add them together, I think there'd be some double counting if we did add them, but you're talking about several £1,000s benefit per person over a 10-year period for a course of intervention of green social prescribing. So if you're seeking to raise money and you say this course, I was involved with a woodland therapy group, said it would, to run a course cost £700 for 20 people, 15 people. Well, the benefits that you're getting from that for each of those people, so 20 times 6,000, is the health costs saved over a 10-year period. You can then write a case for that to seek further money from funders because there's a strong economic case. It's the first time this analysis has been done. It's the, as I said, it's the Treasury Green Book. It's a standard government way of measuring costs and benefits of projects. So green prescribing works. It saves money for the health service. Not really a surprise if you're involved, but we've got some numbers on it now as well. So where does that leave us when I want to just tie back for the final kind of 4 minutes of this talk about the good life and thinking about what we do? Well, if you wanted to prescribe going to the beach as an outdoor activity, look at these people on the beach at Southend. What are they doing? Well, they're doing nothing much at all. They're chatting, walking around, looking at the mud, looking at the sky. If they were at home, they wouldn't dare do nothing. But when you're outdoors, you allow yourself to have a whole day doing not much at all and being really happy for it. So we have to find the environments and the activities that will improve health. Everybody's got a picture of a sunset on their phone. Usually at this point in a talk, I'd say, have you got one? And everyone says, yes, I have. What happens when you see a sunset? We all go, oh, it's lovely, isn't it? And you think, oh, is that an innate thing? No, it's not. It's a learnt behavior that when we see a sunset, we stop for a moment, we calm down, and we look at the environment and we forget about our stresses and anxieties, perhaps for a second or 2 or 10 or 20. And that moment changes how we feel. The same could be said for bird song. If you go out and listen to the birds will be singing. At the end of that, you won't have used up the birds. So this is the thing about engaging with nature, is you don't use it up. Whereas when we have fossil fuels and the material consumption economy, we do things and we use up stuff and there's none left at the end of it. But with nature, we engage with it, we get benefit, and it's still there afterwards. So the birds are still singing when we've finished. So the way that we've also been researching recently has been thinking about what is the good life. It's actually a term that's used across the world. There are some examples in white at the bottom here. It is a key component of happiness. And we just completed a big survey of the good life across a whole range of different countries. I'm going to move on because of timing. And we found that these 7 common features are part of what people from nearly 30 countries said are the elements of the good life. Healthy food, togetherness, connected to nature, physical activity, personal growth, ethical or spiritual coherence, and sustainable consumption. And all of these, interestingly, are low carbon. I've said Japan and Korea are exemplars. They have the longest living people, the fittest, healthiest people, the best diets, the highest plant-based diets, their daily connection to nature, strong spiritual thread to life. All of these are elements of a good life. And the thing that we then did was to say, well, that's very interesting. So what are these components of our living and what can make a difference to cutting carbon? So I've just got the same slide, but with a different picture on each of these to show you that I said at the beginning, our target should be 1 ton per person to reduce, to get carbon across the world in a safe place, around about 10 gigatons. That's billion tons of carbon for 8 billion people. If you adopt a vegetarian diet, you will cut about 0.7 tons off your carbon profile. Higher if it's vegan. If you eat local food, it's about 0.3. If you reduce food waste, it's about 0.25. If you adopt 2 meat-free days a week, it's about 0.2. So changing diet is the first step, one step available to reducing carbon. The green ones are about energy and home, switching to renewable sources, solar PV, refurbishing home, smart metering, lower your house temperature. Interesting to note that the really big ticket item, switch to renewables electricity. That's the one. Install solar PV if you can afford it, but not everybody can. But you're going to save 1.6 tons by switching electricity to renewables. Flights are terrible. Transport is a really big component. If you can switch to active transport, you might save 1.5 tons. Replace your fossil fuel car with a hybrid vehicle, up to a ton, slightly more than that in certain circumstances. But we know that flights are problematic. And a range of things towards the bottom there: tree planting, reusing clothing, reducing textiles, less plastic, and so forth. Small elements. And the reason I show you this is there are lots of choices. Not everybody has to do the same thing. So people can choose to do one thing, then another thing, and then another thing. And we're almost at the end of 2021. If people could do 8 activities over the next 8 years to 2030, we could probably get our individual carbon profiles down to about 1 ton. And the interesting thing is that these map well onto the kinds of green social prescribing options as well. So we can do social prescribing, greenness, and low carbon living at the same time. 2 quotes to finish from the Tao Te Ching and from the wonderful Mary Oliver, who died 2 years ago now. The Tao Te Ching, written 2,500 years ago, in chapter 33, said this: the best things in life are not things. Well, that's Gary Snyder's translation. There are many translations of the original, but I think that one will do for me. And Mary Oliver wrote a wonderful 7-word poem. She called it Instructions for Living a Life. It was: pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And I think that works when we're thinking about nature, natural places, being with others, togetherness and belonging, is if we pay attention to that, think how wonderful it is, and then tell others, we're going to be making progress. So thanks very much, everybody. Some pics of some books that Amy mentioned earlier on. This is my most recent book, Stories and Tales about Living Close to the Land. And thank you, everybody.